This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Shemot series, First Principles of Nationhood, where we're exploring what axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are. How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor Shemot episodes. Parshat Tetzaveh's main focus is the priestly garments. The Kohen Gadol wore 8 garments during the year: the breastpiece, the choshen, the vest upon which the choshen was worn called the ephod, a long robe, the me'il made of tchelet, a headdress, the mitznefet, and a sash, the avnet. Underneath these garments were also a pair of pants, which we'll talk about in today's episode as well. The high priest also wore the tzniut, the gold crown that said Kadosh LaHashem. The regular priest wore 4 garments, much simpler. These are the same white garments that the Kohen Gadol wore on Yom Kippur. And after we have the detail of all these garments, instructions are relayed for the inauguration ceremony of the priests. But this ceremony only takes place in Vayikra chapters 8 and 9, Chet and Tet. The ceremony combines animal and meal offerings, washing the body, and robing the priests. The parsha ends with the building details of the Mizbeach HaKtoret, the incense altar, which is really part of a longer section that follows, and that is included in Parshat Ki Tisa, which details additional elements of the Mishkan not mentioned until now. I am thrilled to welcome back to the podcast, Rabbanit Shayna Goldberg. She's been on this podcast many times, but the first time we're filming with her here in the studio. So I'm really, really happy that Shayna's here. Shayna teaches in the Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash. She functions as a U.S. halakhic and a Madrichat Kalot. And she has some amazing content on several modern Orthodox podcasts, such as 1840, Orthodox Conundrum, and Singled Out, where she has shared her wisdom on topics of sexuality, tzniut, and the education of both of those issues. Shayna is also the author of the book, What Do You Really Want? Trust and Fear and Decision Making at Life's Crossroads and Everyday Living, which is also being put out in Hebrew, Bezrat Hashem, this year. So Shayna, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
So good to be here with you.
But I want to also plug some of the episodes that we did in the past. We spoke twice about Jewish sexual ethics for Parshiot in the book of Vayikra. And if you want to reference back, they were episodes 104 and 162. The first was on sexual ethics as reflected by the list of sexual prohibitions in the book of Vayikra, and another episode on the idea of touch, both as Shmirat Negiah and also the prohibition of touch in the form of halachot for married couples. I really recommend listening to those episodes for those who might have missed them. So Shayna, today we're sitting back here to speak about the clothing, right? The clothing that we have in our parsha is formed through the clothing of the Kohen Gadol. But in this podcast series, where we're really trying to think about first principles, ideas that sort of sit at the root of who we are and also manifest in very, very concrete ways in our lives, we wanted to dedicate today's episode to speaking about clothing as a concept. Obviously, it can be looked at through the prism of tzniut. We might touch upon that, but it's, as we'll see, it's something so much bigger. So why don't we jump into that?
Absolutely. I think, as you said earlier, the first half of this parsha really focuses on the clothing, on the different garments that were worn by the regular Kohanim and by the Kohen Gadol. And it's a great opportunity, a springboard to talk about clothing and the different roles, the different functions that clothing play in our lives, I think both as individuals and as a nation. And if we start with the parsha, as a foundation for that, I think there's 2 things that come up in the parsha that we very quickly could see, like 2 really basic and important roles that clothing play. So we'll begin with in Parak Chavchet, Pasuk Mem Bet, we have the pasuk that discusses the pants, the linen breeches that the Kohanim wore, and it says there, "V'asalahem mechnasei bad lechasot basar erva mimadnayim v'ad yorechaim yiyu," that they need to have these pants, these breeches that they're wearing under the other garments that they wore, with the main intent being the chasot basar erva, to cover nakedness. And I think, first, before we discuss anything else, like clothing at its very, on the very minimal level, is there to cover nakedness, to give protection. It's the most basic, I think, role. It's, if we talk about also where clothing first appears, and I'm sure we'll discuss, Adam and Chava. So the very first thing thing that they do is cover up private parts. But obviously, like we have so many sources that talk about even like the necessary role of like the importance of covering things. Like the Rambam discusses how one of the main obligations that a husband has when he marries his wife is to take care of what we call tzniut, of making sure that she has clothing to cover herself, clothing that's good for the winter, that's good for the summer. In Eshet Chayil, right, we talk about a woman who's lo tira lebeta mishalek kol beta lavushanim, that she's looking out for her family members and making sure that they're properly dressed and they're properly protected. So I think we see that, right away in the descriptions here that are offered in our parsha. But it's interesting that 2 psukim earlier, before talking about the role of covering erva, the pasuk mem says, "Ulvnei Aharon taseh kotnot v'asita lehem avnetim umagbaot taseh lehem lechavod u'letiferet." The 2 psukim earlier, it talks about the sons of Aaron having coats and girdles and turbans, not for covering, not because those items are there to cover nakedness, but lechavod u'letiferet, which I guess we could translate as for honor, for dignity, for beauty, and that's interesting to me.
I think also the order here is something that we should think about, meaning because you presented the second one first.
Right, because it's more basic, but you're right.
Right, but isn't it interesting that meaning in our frame, it seems more basic. And I think that it does. There's something subsistence about it, meaning you have to cover the things that need to be covered for the sake of just physically protecting your body. Meaning it's not a highly sexual reference, right? The erva is something that needs to be covered. In this case, it needs to be covered because it's not physically wise. Maybe in this case, it also isn't appropriate. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we'll go back to a different context, but the first thing that's mentioned in the context of Kohanim specifically, and we could think about how much that translates into the regular people's life, but the first thing mentioned is this, that there's something that we want to elevate humans with this kind of clothing, meaning it needs to be, it's a level, I agree with you, it's a level beyond, but isn't it interesting that the Torah presents that first?
Yeah.
And I think it starts with the outer impressiveness, and only after it gets to the underneath,
right.
The garments
I guess
underneath.
It starts with the first thing that you're going to notice when you look at the Kohanim, which are these like special garments that stand out and that make them unique. I think I'm thinking about, wow, why is that, the way things are framed in my head? And I guess it ties back to, because when I think about clothing, and it's a topic I teach often and discuss, I guess I always go back to Adam and Chava, and there, it started with them covering themselves with the alei teina, and then moving on from there to Hashem providing them with kotnot or. But I love how it's flipped here, because I think in our human experience, at least in interacting with people, the first thing that we're going to see is the kavod or the tiferet. How is this person dressed, and does their clothing add dignity to them, or maybe it actually takes away from it.
I'm also thinking, and I know that this is utterly influenced by a novel I just read, but I'm thinking so much now about how the idea of clothes being something of like subsistence, like it's a basic necessity. We are so far from this in a society, the Hebrew is chavrat shefa, like a society of abundance that we're living in, where it's, thank God, although I think it has other curses to it, we are so far from looking at clothing as being the necessity. Like when the halakha requires a man to provide his wife with clothing, it's because people didn't have much clothing, right? And having those few sets, I literally
they didn't have 30 dresses.
Exactly. I just heard in a different program I was listening to, I think it was Abigail Adams, but excuse me if I'm quoting this wrong. She was considered to be like extremely luxurious and had a tremendous amount of clothing, and she had 15 dresses. Right. And the average person today, I think the average is at about 150 clothing items in your closet. Now, again, doesn't mean every outfit, but if you count
many of which
items,
you'll discard and replace
exactly.
at some
and
point.
So just even when you bring up the idea of clothing being like this basic function, like how far? Again, I'm not lamenting it. I'm just observing it right now. Like we're so far from looking at clothing as being like this basic item that we need, and we've gone into such a different area of clothing in the world today.
Yeah, that's very true. And we don't want to not acknowledge that, I think, because especially when we look around, at countries or populations or civilizations where wealth is not a given, or that abundance is not something that's taken for granted, people aren't privileged in those ways. So it's not something that you want to overlook. And I guess in a way, maybe that's why I started there, because it is something that until you have that, until you know that you could be warm on a cold day, or that you could have appropriate, an appropriate hat to protect you from the sun, it's hard to think about the next items. And yet the kavod and tiferet part of clothing is something that even the Rambam, and he's talking about how important it is for a Talmid Chacham to dress in a way that's naki and na'eh, because he's representing also Torah. When people see him, if he's wearing just the basics, or he's not giving off an aura that makes them stop and feel like, wow, that's a dignified person, there's an understanding that could affect the way that they see Torah.
Yeah. And I think that even in a society, let's even take the original Torah population, where it's even more moving, the emphasis on clothing being lechavod u'letiferet, because they didn't have that. Do you know what I'm saying? Meaning for us, it's much more accessible to us, to use clothing in that kind of way. And I kind of wonder, would I look at the Kohen Gadol and think that he looks impressive today? Do you know what I mean? But I think that in the world we're living in now, what's fascinating is that people, even with all the abundance, can still get dressed up and still not reflect kavod v'tiferet. Meaning, just because you have a lot of choice of what to put on doesn't mean that somebody has understood or really
grasp.
Really grasp what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think actually the fact that ksut, when we talk about what's included in that obligation, and they say it's not just making sure that a wife is protected and she has the clothing that's ra'oi, that's appropriate for that season, but also that he buys her jewelry or he buys her colored garments. It says at the very least, kind of what's the norm of that time. There is an understanding that it's important for people's own dignity to feel good in what they wear. I think I teach in Beit Midrash and Migdaluz, where we've taught us all together, and I think about on a Friday night when 200 young women come up for Kabbalat Shabbat, how rare it is that two of them are wearing the same dress, and when that happens, everyone's like, oh, she's also wearing that dress or whatever. Now, why is that? It's because clothing is something that I think gives people that kind of unique way to express how they feel good about themselves, and that's going to be different with each person when we talk about just clothing as covering. So then you don't need to see that uniqueness. You don't need to see any of that, beauty or expression come to bear. And to me, it's very meaningful that the Torah understands that that's an important part of what clothing is for us.
Maybe, could we go back to Gan Eden for a moment?
Sure.
Let's go, I want to look at those.
I think that's important.
Yeah, look at those psukim. As you already mentioned, the first concept of covering, and it's a question whether the context is negative or not, is in the efforts of Adam and Chava, as you said, to put on these sort of fig leaves, which are, particularly large leaves, right? That's why they're probably the ones chosen. They put on these fig leaves to cover at least their basic genitalia, it seems, when they realize what they've done. Again, that often has given clothing at a first look a sort of a negative reputation, because it seems to be a negative context, and many have really tried to figure out what is that? Meaning, what is it about they're involving themselves in non-obedient behavior, then makes them feel like they have to cover themselves up. Right. And I think that, again, there's many different interpretations.
And as a result of the sin.
Yeah. And then they cover up a very particular place, and then it leads to all different kinds of commentaries. Maybe there was sexual sin involved, or how to understand exactly this process that's happening. But I think that on just a very basic human level, and when somebody knows they've done something wrong, they often just want to hide themselves. They feel that they want to kind of disappear. They feel ashamed of what they've done, and therefore they cover up. Curious what you think about that first moment of clothing.
I think I've been very influenced by something I heard years ago in high school. I heard it from my mother because I was glad to be in her class.
It's such a nice sentence, Shayna. It's such a nice sentence.
My mother taught a woman in Jewish law. They used to call it widgel and sensual. And when she discussed clothing, she shared an idea. I think it may have been rooted in this series of lectures. It was called Our Bodies, Our Souls, from the Yerushalayim, that she appreciated. But I don't even know anymore if it's this, there was a kernel of there. I don't know if this is totally from that. Mm-hmm. But trying to kind of almost flip it around, like what's going on here? What's happening on a deeper level? Is it just that shame of like sin, or we messed up and we need to disappear, we need to hide? And I remember the idea was based in the first needing to understand Gan Eden as a place that perhaps there was no split between the physical or the concrete, the material, and the spiritual, the way that we experience the world today. Meaning that when Adam looked at Chava, he didn't see first a body and then, okay, now I need to get to know her. You know, it was completely integrated, whatever terms you want to use to describe that. Like he looked at Chava, or Chava looked at Adam and saw their essence, saw their quality traits, saw their midot, saw who they were, saw, you know, like what was important to them. And therefore you didn't need clothing, because you could look at the person and you could have an understanding of who they were. I think about it sometimes in the context, you know, of dating, because both of us speak a lot to young people who are dating, and we know that the way people look changes as you get to know them. You know, I could remember my husband and I were at the same Stern YU graduation. I wasn't dating him at the time, and I remember like they announced his name, and I remember like seeing him as a stranger, like, oh, okay, that's, you know, Judah Goldberg, and then starting to date him and realizing, oh wait, he already looks different. And then as time goes on, being like, oh, he doesn't, I can remember the way I saw him the first date, and then like he doesn't look that way anymore. People evolve because you know their soul. And after the eating from the Eitz Hadat, I think there's interpretations who think that maybe what happened there, or the dot that they suddenly had, or the difference between Tov and Ra, whatever that means, is that there's a physical world and there's a spiritual world, and kinds of the two are very separate. And now when I look at someone, I just see the physical. So if you're looking at somebody and they're naked and you just see, okay, they have a beauty mark there, or forget about that, you just see a male body or female body, you have no way of knowing who this person is, meaning you're stuck just at the very physical thing. My mother used to say, like, maybe the people who understood this best were the Nazis, because they used to strip people down, whether or not it was effective, just as a way of dehumanizing people. Because if you think about it, it's a lot easier to kill naked bodies. There's something that turns them into animals, you know, as opposed to like, whoa, that woman has the same dress that my wife has, or that little boy is wearing, you know, a shirt that is from the same store that my son gets his clothing from. So I think about it in the terms of this story, that when they put on clothing, if we want to move away from just the shame, which I think there is an element of that, obviously, but if we want to move away from that, I think maybe what the Torah is trying to tell us is that clothing isn't there so much to cover the body as it is to expose the soul. Meaning that we put on clothing not to cover our physical body because we're ashamed or because something's wrong with it, but actually as a way to now give people insight. If you can't look at me and just see who I am anymore, let me use my clothing as a way to at least give you a taste of the mood that I'm in today, or the community that I associate with, or, you know, I don't know, like something that has meaning to me. And clothing, and then takes on so many different levels of meaning in terms of helping people have real understanding of who we are.
I think also the fact that it is a voluntary action on their part, it's presented almost as intuitive, but the vayitperu ale teina vayasu lehem chagorot, that they did some sort of action of sewing and made these sort of, you know, coverings for themselves, not belts, more like a covering. And I think what's interesting about that is that we dafka see them taking initiative in this process, and which, you know, until now there has been negative initiative taking. So here they're doing something that's proactive. And I think that it really dovetails with that idea of something individual about it, meaning they're each making their own individual covering for themselves. And while obviously I don't think that their fig coverings were reflecting what communities they were a part of, I think that the idea of it being an initiative-taking endeavor is something that fits with that. But then I also am curious then how you look at the idea of Hashem adding something something else to the covering, meaning we started off with a minimal genitalia covering, which seemed, functional. And I think very much speaks to this idea of, well, there's just looking at someone and seeing their body, and there's looking at someone and seeing like the sexual elements of their body, which again is just runs through this story as like a river runs through Gan Eden. It's there in every part of the story, but I don't think it's the main focus of the story at all. It's never how I look at the Gan Eden story. But then Hashem comes and like adds something else for them, which of course is machoke. What is it that he added? But it's some sort of fuller covering of some sort. And I'm curious also, what do you think about that? Like, why does Hashem have to come and add more? Meaning on a physical level, yes, to survive in the wilderness once you're kicked out of this idyllic place that you need, as we said, it's a basic level of subsistence. You can't go out into the fields where there's thorns and be vulnerable to those elements. But what else is there?
Rav Lichtenstein has a beautiful article on this last night when I was looking at it again. So my husband walked by and he's like, I was in yeshiva for this sikha, and I remember what an impact he made on him. Especially because in the middle, Rav Lichtenstein in English said Humpty Dumpty before, like that all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put Humpty Dumpty together again, which did not make it into the written version of the sikha. But because there is a shattering of sorts, as you said, of like, wow, something major, going back to first principles or core values, something big changed in the way that the world works. So before I read that article, I just looked at it as like, there's like the Sor Meirah, and there's the Aseh Tov. Like first we have to kind of move away from, wow, we're getting distracted by the externals. Our bodies are different. So like, let's cover up like, the differences. And that way, like we won't be distracted and there'll be some kind of leveling of like, we at least could look past that. And then God maybe comes and says, but clothing's so much more than that. It's not just about like covering. It's about giving you literally a new skin, a new understanding of yourself, a new way of presenting yourself. And maybe
also it's that same dichotomy. I think also, just as we saw 2 layers by the Kohanim, so we see these 2 layers in Gan Eden. I mean, we have the erva, or the the breeches, the underneath pants that they were wearing, and no, it's not a breech. It's called a breech. What's it called?
No, breeches.
Breeches. Okay, it's fine. We'll keep it. And then the second level is the kavod l'tiferet, meaning it's something much bigger than that. It's much more about like a pragmatic covering.
Yes.
So what I'll
add, though, that Rav Lichtenstein goes a little bit further than that. And he says, connecting back to your original idea, that when there's shame, or there's that sense of like, we did something wrong, we want to run away, we want to cover ourselves. So that could, lead people to understand that like, okay, we did something wrong. But like the shame itself is just like a bad feeling. It doesn't necessarily lead people to make the positive change.
Yeah.
We know people could get stuck in the shame and they could just be depressed.
How he knew that and said that so many years ago, well before Brene Brown and,
totally, right?
and Dr. Becky or whoever else people are listening to. I was really moved, by the way, about that.
Right? Sometimes we get reminders that it's all in here if we're able to have that prism through which we see things. Yeah, so Rav Lichtenstein says shame is that sense of discomfort, the kind of thing that makes you not want to get out of bed. But it doesn't give you necessarily the realization of like, what do I need to do to move forward? And when God comes and he gives them the clothing, he's basically saying, hey, you're no longer part of like the animal kingdom. Like you have a role to play in this world. You literally need like, when we say, okay, I need to like, I feel like I'm in a new skin, or I need to like kind of change things up. Like he literally gave them garments that were meant to give them kavod and tiferet, like that were meant to remind them, even though right now you're feeling bad, there's a tshuva process, there's a transformation that you're capable of going through, kind of like get on with it. Like don't stay stuck in that, degrading, beating yourself up place.
Also, of course, it's important to mention that the word tzniut, it repeats itself in very, it's the word, right? Yeah. It's the word by the Kohanim. It's the word also in the creation. And it's also, of course, in the story of Yosef, meaning there's something that's also in the story of Tamar. And I'm not in Tamar, but that's a negative context. But like this idea of having this covering that is clearly meant to be something that is more dignifying, that is this piece of kavod, the word, that's the signaling word in the Torah, this kind of additional covering piece.
Yeah. And I don't know, if by the Kohanim, the clothing that they're given is meant to like single them out from others. I don't know if that was the purpose, like if the purpose of their clothing is to distinguish them. But when I go like with my kids to Machon HaMikdash and you see these huge paintings of scenes from the Mikdash, which, you know, we hope we'll return to one day, it is like right away you see who the Kohanim are based on their clothing. And I do think that there's something about clothing that beyond, you know, the first two things that we spoke about, which is basic protection or dignity and like honor or like a sense of beauty that maybe someone has for herself, this idea that clothing represents who we are to others, that like people could look at us and know something about us. Something I think about, my husband's a doctor, and actually, you know, when you start medical school, the first ceremony that they have is called the white coat ceremony, and it was so not his thing. He actually even published an article about that sense of like how doctors have to hold themselves above, like the doctors have the white coat, not their nurse, you know what I mean? But it's a real thing in medicine of like, you know, everyone knows who the doctor is because of the white coat, or how meaningful in this country an extra stripe is on a uniform. Like clothing signifies something, or the reason why so many young women in the army, even though they may not continue, let's say, in that path once they finish the army, may choose to wear a skirt in the army so that everybody knows that they are a religious woman in the army. That idea of like clothing representing who we are to others, I think a little bit, again, I'm not sure it's the purpose of the Kohanim's clothing at all, but I do think that it is something that we see come up in Tanakh a lot, beyond these two elements that we just hit on that come out of the parsha, our parsha of Tetzaveh and parsha Breshit. I think there's a lot of other roles that clothing play. And, you know, I know as a young kid, that idea that in Mitzrayim, Bnei Israel, you know, the Midrash says, were mishunim. They were different, or they were mitsuyanim. They were distinguishable because of their, you know, malbusham, the way that they dressed, is something that I think has a lot of value, even today, in the sense of like just understanding that, like what I said earlier, that clothing is, it's not only about covering ourselves, it's also about bringing ourselves. It's about exposing who we are on a much deeper level and giving people a window into that.
So first, I'm just curious, where else in Tanakh do you feel that we see this?
So the research that was done, that like I think about often, I'm connected to a website called Dracheha, which is about women and mitzvot. And when Lori Novik, who's heads that
who's
website.
Been on this podcast. Who's been on this podcast.
She's wonderful. Yeah. So when we were discussing how we wanted to frame the topic of clothing, and especially tzniut, specifically for women, we wanted to take a step back and talk about clothing in general, not just to get in, clothing is also relevant to men, but because I really believe on a core level, speaking about, you know, axiomatic principles, that clothing is so much bigger. It is so core to who we are. And really looked for different examples in Tanakh of each of these ideas, and in halacha of each of these ideas. And let's say two, you know, or even three that jump to mind very quickly is when Paro wants to appoint Yosef as his second in command. So he makes the effort to like give him the tabad and to put it on his hand, to give him the big day shesh, you know, to like, to make it clear. Same when Achashverosh wants Haman to lead Mordechai through the streets of Shushan. It's all about the clothing. Like he needs to be dressed in specific clothing, or maybe the most bolate, you know, very standout example is when the Torah tells us that Rivka dresses Yaakov in the big day Esav, because why? So that literally Yitzchak will think that he's somebody else. We see that clothing definitely conveys a message of who we are to other people.
So I want to play devil's advocate for a moment and bring to you the people that our students, right? And something that often comes out in these conversations, and this may be representing the people listening to the podcast, maybe representing their children. So often, I'm sure you hear the same thing, that students will say, I don't want people to know about me from my clothing, Meaning, I don't like the notions or the preconceived notions, or you walked in, with your mitpachad, and I walked in with my mitpachad, and they already think things about me, right?
Right.
Meaning that very often that'll be what they say, right? Put that on, or put that on, and people assume X. And I've heard it on both sides. I've heard people say, I dress really frum, but I'm not actually so frum, and that creates a dissonance for me. That's hard to bear, right?
Or someone who dresses really frum and they get away with saying some, outlandish things, but somehow it just goes beneath the radar because people don't expect that to be coming from them, so they understand it differently.
Yeah, but what do you think about that? Yeah. What do you think about I think it's somewhat newish, the desire to separate how people physically represent with who they are. Meaning there are those who look and say, I don't like this connection, Shayna. I don't want it to be connected. I don't want people to think that they could see how I dress and know about me. What do you think about that?
First of all, it resonates. I myself feel that sometimes. And I also, when I'm teaching young women, definitely try to validate that sense, because it is hard to feel like you're tagged automatically by what you wear, and especially for young women who maybe find the specific halachot of tzniut to be challenging, to feel like I'm written off as not so religious, but I daven 3 times a day and I learn a tremendous amount of Torah and I do a lot of chesed, or all other kinds of things that we greatly value, and yet no one could see past, my clothing. So in all directions, I understand that. And yet what I try to kind of share is that, right, that's one of the sad consequences of what happened in Gan Eden, halavai, that we return to a world where somebody could look at you, regardless of whether, we'll need clothing or not. But I'm saying where someone could look at you and really know who you are just from seeing you. That strangers could pass you on the street and have a sense of who this person is and their value, whatever. But that's not the world that we're living in. And I go to just a very real place, in discussing this with people, of we all know that when it comes to the way we look at other people, halavai, that we were able to see just, the inner core, but we also know that we make snap judgments of people based on their clothing. And the reason that we allow ourselves to do that is because practically we don't have another way to maneuver in the world. We live in a physical world, but also people at the end of the day get up and make choices. So if a person leaves the house in a certain way, we assume that they understand the message that may, kind of broadcast to the world, and that they own it because they got up and they decided to leave their house like that. So that idea, that concept, which maybe I talk about so much that it's something almost that I feel like I'm mocked for sometimes, but taking responsibility, owning your decisions, understanding that things have consequences. And I'll say to them all the time, before we talk about halacha, before I talk about anything else, dress in the way that you want to be perceived, because that's the world that we live in. Now, if you're well, I don't care how people look at me, great. So you don't care how people perceive you. But if you're going to come afterwards crying, but how come they didn't take me for the job when I showed up like that to the interview? Don't they see something more? How come, this person didn't want to go out with me? How come it's no, but you can have it both ways, own it. Own it. As long as you own it, it's fine. But I even think back to when Judah started working in the ER, the head of the department, a woman, had to send out email to all the new residents, that many of them were women, that you can't come to work with pigtails. And there was that pushback of why are patients judging me? I went to this top-notch university. I got the best education in the world. Why are they judging me? I'm a really good doctor. Why do they care if I'm wearing pigtails? And it's because if you get up in the morning and you put pigtails in your hair and you come to, work like Pippi Longstocking or whatever, that sometimes can make the patient feel, whether it's right or wrong, whether they should be judging you or not, that you don't take yourself seriously. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't make them feel comfortable. And I think that message of taking responsibility and people just being honest about, for better or worse, this could be the result of the chid in Gan Eden, that's the world that we live in.
I think also, of course, there's an element here of identity, which often takes time for the dust to settle on that. Meaning, I think that this is a particularly strong internal dilemma for a certain age bracket. And obviously it can have resurgence. And, we could see many people now. People are always revisiting everything now. So a lot of these age brackets have lost their meaning. But still, psychological development, I think, has a decade wherein these are hot button issues, or a decade and a half. And then at a certain point, I really, really would hope, I would add to that same message that you've just said right now, that work hard to feel identified with the way you're presenting, meaning because a lot of people have the pushback is on the fakeness that they feel, to quote
the superficiality, or the external element
I want to send that message, so I'll do X. But my add-on to that would be, no, you should be working to feel organic inside and outside. You want that to be you want to feel identified with that image of yourself. So and that's the biggest compliment that a person can receive, that, tocho kevaro, meaning that there's an organic cohesiveness about what they are on the inside and what is presented on the outside.
Totally. When I say just the way that you want to be perceived, I don't mean, just as something that you're not. I mean, take into account the way that you want to be perceived and think about what that means about who you are and what's core to you. But I guess I will say that as much as we want that integrated whole that you just spoke about, people do have different parts of themselves or different facets. Yeah. You know what I mean? So it makes me think about a story I often tell where years ago, really a long time ago, before I made Aliyah, I was invited to come speak to the young men in YU Smicha about what it means to be a yoetzet halakha. And at the time, there's only me and one other yoetzet halakha in America, and it was very controversial. And even the fact that a certain person invited me was not something that was accepted by most of the staff there. But he thought it was important for these young men to understand what it means to be a yoetzet. And I remember saying to my husband, I am going to come in the frimiest clothing, the frimiest sheitel, but that I have. Now, I didn't go and borrow clothing from a friend. Yeah. I have a lot of different outfits in my closet, and I thought carefully, how do I want to be perceived when I walk in the room? Now, not because I cared about these young men, because I cared about the material and the content that I was going to be giving them. And I said they are most likely to internalize what I say if I come in and I look like their wives, or I look like someone that they could identify with. And indeed, I opened the door and I remember the looks on their faces. I don't know what they were expecting, who they thought was going to walk in there. But it was this look of what? She's the yoetzet halakha? She looks like someone who has some yiras shamayim, And then I felt like the sikha was a completely different experience. Their hearts were open to hearing me. Whereas when I go to speak in communities, let's say, of women who may think of women who engage in Torah as what connection do I have to her? What woman sits and learns Torah, as, her profession today. So I thought, okay, what am I going to wear that's going to make them feel oh, she's actually not so different than us, I think those things, again, we're not doing it from that superficial external place. I'm doing it, I think, from the deepest place that there is, which is I want to connect to people. I want them to feel comfortable. I want my messages to resonate. And I understand that we live in a physical world. And as much as maybe we'd like to go back to a world that's totally spiritual, we have to acknowledge and work with the, where we find ourselves.
Totally. I think that also, Shayna, part of the pushback on that is that, of course, sometimes what is considered to be a halakhic norm, we're not doing any definitions today of what's halakhic dress or not, but sometimes there is a gap between what people want to do on the inside and the halakhic norm for where they're living. And that sometimes creates the feeling of that there's a lack of candidness, or a certain I'm faking it, an inconsistency. It's because sometimes they're trying to live up to a standard that is the norm of their community, and that may not be what they're holding. So meaning the idea of you want to self-represent, sometimes it has a limit, right? And that what they want to self-represent doesn't always fit with a Torah community definition of that.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I think that's also...
Yeah, totally. I think also the element of who am I as an individual versus my identity as part of a group, is part of that tension of like, we like belonging to groups. As human beings, we crave belonging and we want to be part of like a social circle. People are very lonely when they're not, but then we also push back of like, but I'm still my own person in this, and just because I'm part of this group doesn't mean that I'm like everybody else. So I think that's also part of like sometimes the tension that we feel in our religious communities. And still we know as people who travel the world sometimes that like when you are in a foreign country and you see a man in a kippah, or you see a young woman that based on her dress, she's clearly religious, there's this sense of like automatic connection, where like if you're that person, someone who you wouldn't have known is Jewish sometimes comes over and like, bagels you. They want it to be known that they're also Jewish. So they'll be like, oh, are you getting ready for Shabbat? Or something like that, even though it's Wednesday, or, they want it to be clear. And you're like, what is that? Like that group identity is very important. And at the same time, like you said, if I go to Tel Aviv now in this mipachat, the sense that other people are going to associate me with a group and be like, oh, for sure she thinks this about the hostage deal, or for sure she voted for this political party, or she's, definitely a mitnat chalet. I guess, we are settlers, I guess. But like, meaning that whatever they have in their minds as their markers for that group are things that people, they don't want to be associated with that all the time, or at least they want to choose which parts of it they're associated with.
Yeah, I mean, I just, students will say that all the time, meaning that piece. Also because in Israel specifically, and here I'll focus us in Israel for a moment, the clothing, I don't know if it has a lot of variation in it in terms of like what is part of the community. Do you know what I'm saying?
Definitely a much wider
There's
spectrum.
a much wider spectrum of what's part of the community. So like there's a lot of ways to be in or in and out. And there's still all these really quiet markers that people who are in the religious world can still pick up on. I like the bageling, by the way. I never heard that phrase, but I think that like that there, you have an ability to sort of slip in and out a little bit in Israel. But on the other hand, a lot of the clothing choices really, as you said, it's much more than, oh, they must be religious. Like here, it often has political associations. So like I'm saying from the young women who sort of push back on a lot of these things, it's not just, oh, I'm a from woman or man, but it's that it also comes along with other assumptions about who they are. And I think that I feel it's a little bit stronger even maybe in Israel at the moment than it is, let's say, if you're a religious person living, whatever, in, I don't know, Muncie or Chicago. But maybe I'm underestimating their community cues. I don't know.
I think the tensions are real everywhere. The where you are on the spectrum is going to create different tensions. But those tensions between, on the one hand, I want to belong, and on the other hand, don't tag me, I think come together. And I think everyone feels them probably in every community. Like I bet if we walked into, Hasidic community and they, you see all of a sudden in communities where there's more uniformity that the socks or the watches or the thing, like the haircuts, things, because people want to find their ways to be individuals. Yeah. I'll share an interesting story that years ago when I taught in Mayanot, and I shared this point, so I got a lot of pushback because I taught seniors, and it's the age where like I'm an individual and don't box me in is like something that people are really dealing with. And there were two students that were really like arguing with me on this point, and I was like, okay, you don't have to accept it, like, it's fine, this is how I feel or whatever. And then I guess God has a great sense of humor, and they came back to me on Monday and they're like, you're not going to believe what happened to us. They're like, Saturday night we were at the mall, and there were these two Hasidic women, and they were walking around. We heard them talking between themselves, wondering if the ice cream store was kosher, like if it had a hechsher. They clearly weren't, from the area. They're like, and we knew that it was kosher. We knew it was under the RCBC or whatever. But they're like, but we were waiting for them to ask us. And all of a sudden we realized, hey, we're in our jeans and our sweatshirts or whatever. And they don't realize that we're religious. You're in a community. Yeah, they don't realize that we're religious. And they're like, we went over and they're like, oh, we're religious and we're from here and whatever. And they're like, okay, so maybe your point, like had something to it. Because on the one hand, again, they wanted to run away from it. And on the other hand, all of a sudden you realize, no, actually, like that is a part of who I am. So I think it's complex for everybody.
Yeah. I think one other piece that I think about in this conversation is, and this is a little bit of a cultural piece that I think is significant, is that in Israel, and again, this is so different depending on where you are in Israel, and I can't really make generalizations, but something that I am happy about that still exists in the state of Israel is that there is still an ethic of simplicity.
Yes.
That doesn't exist in the same way. We don't have to go as far as the, Avital Chizik and Chaim Seiman articles about, the materialism or all those different things that are raging in other more North American cultures, but there still is an ethic of simplicity here that will reflect itself in people showing up to a wedding in an outfit that I really think what might have been a good idea to change where they came, or just, even I tell you something, that a fight that I have with my 12 and 10-year-old is very, very in fashion right now for the tweens, is like a white shirt on Shabbat that is not particularly attractive and like some sort of like flowery skirt. Now, in any kind of cultural reference that I have, and I'm fairly Israeli, right? Shayna knows this, but like in my heart of cultural references, like nothing about that outfit says Shabbat to me. And I have a hard time with it. And it's definitely not how I raised them, because I raised them and we dafka shopped in Haredi stores, and, it was a little bit of like a different standard. And it's something that, and I have actually, I haven't really let up on it. Like I'm holding strong in it because I said it, but I recognize it in the culture we're living in. A white shirt has its own religious status, just period.
Totally.
It has its own religious status.
Doesn't matter what white shirt it is.
Doesn't matter how many holes it has religious status, okay? So the white shirt is a thing, and there just isn't that ethic. Here I'm speaking only in the Dati-Lumi world. Obviously it's different in in other populations, but it doesn't have the same ethic of fanciness. Now, I totally and completely am thrilled about that on so many levels. On the other hand, sometimes there could be these moments where like, comes up short,
As so many things in life.
It's not kavod v'tiferet.
No, right. As so many things in life, it's mixed because, it's like whenever you have a quality that you really value, and here it's that simplicity, and it's that we don't care so much about the externals, and we are able to kind of more accept a wider spectrum of the way people dress, and we don't box people in as much. So the kind of flip side of that same coin is going to be, but like maybe you took a little too far, or I guess one other factor that I'll raise in terms of a significance of clothing is clothing has an influence on the environment. So that's exactly what you're saying. Like Shabbos feels different when people come to the table in their pajamas. And I've been in houses, I would sometimes go to friends where that was the case. And you're like, this doesn't feel like Shabbos, even though the candles are lit over there, but doesn't have that shot. Or when, we're makpid, everyone's getting dressed. It doesn't matter. That was just the family at home, Or I remember one time in Migdalus, they had a pegesh, like a community, like a Beit Midrash-wide discussion about Shabbat on a Tuesday evening. And they asked everyone to come in their Shabbos clothes.
Oh, that's so
it was
smart.
Fascinating. Wow. You really felt that Avira, that feeling of Shabbat in the room. It totally changed the ability to talk about Shabbat, that everyone was in their Shabbos clothes. Or as you said, you go to a wedding where everyone's in jeans and a t-shirt, and on the one hand, you're so happy. Wow, it's Israel. Just come, bring yourself, we're so happy you're here. And on the other hand, a wedding feels different when there's a certain mood because people made the effort.
Yeah, they took the time to get ready, to respect the event as it's happening, right? It's not just a rolled from one thing to the next in my day. Like this is the thing that deserves attention, and bringing attention to our clothing as a way that we signal to people that we've paid attention. And I'll just share one story also from another one of these, Beit Midrash meetings that we were at. It's hilarious what things your students remember, and it's usually never the things you plan to say. So last year I showed up to one of these big Beit Midrash meetings. I had this pretty flashy, like pink outfit. It was like a pink.
I remember it.
It was a pink shirt and skirt. And I shared in my remarks that like I made to the students, and I said, I changed to come to this meeting. I thought that this outfit would reflect more what I want to say, which is I want to talk about the fact that as religious women, we should put effort. Again, this is a little bit of the backlash there of like the simplicity plus. And I said, when we want to represent Torah, whether it's a Torah lifestyle or because we're teaching it, it's really important. You've said this already a million times in your remarks now, but meaning I said to them in a very real life way, I said, I want to represent that. Like, I do not believe that I should look dowdy or unattractive because I'm, Rabbanit, like lehefech. I think that I want Torah to be attractive, and I want that to be something that feels vibrant and alive. That's what I mean by attractive, right?
Yeah.
I want it to be vibrant and alive. And I said, and therefore I changed from what I did at work, and I put on something else. I said it made me feel more excited to come, and it's something that just is to me, it represents the point that I want to make. And it doesn't matter what else I said, because just the pink outfit, it was the only thing that they'll remember.
Yeah, and when you have a lot of people doing that together, I just finished I came back from a trip to different high schools in America. The minute you walk into the lobby of a school, you get a sense of how serious the students take themselves based on there's different schools, there's different feelings, there's different dress codes, and you feel it. And the reason the Knesset cares a lot about the dress code is you want people to come to work, you want there to be a dignified feeling. Or I even think about in this country, why do they care so much that all the soldiers travel to and from their bases in the uniform, right? Because we all know from living here that there's a feeling when you see soldiers in the street, it gives a sense of security, whether it's a false sense of security, so we could debate it, but it gives a sense of security. Or if all of a sudden you're on a bus and people are nervous about some guy who's suspicious, and a soldier walks onto the bus in uniform, you kind of feel this sense of relief. Now, it could be he doesn't even have any neshek, any gun on him. It could be that he's your neighbor's son who a second ago was playing basketball in the driveway, and you're like, what's he gonna, do to protect us? But the uniform has a real effect on the environment, and that's why they always want there to be a sense of that they're soldiers walking around. So I think the influence on environment is something that we also see in Tanakh. Even the fact that, let's say, Mordechai, he wasn't able to go in his sak and efer into the Shar HaMelech because it says Ke'en levo el Shar HaMelech b'levu sak. It's not how you walk into the palace. The same way years ago, there was an article in the New York Times about a volleyball team that came to meet with, I think it was President Bush. And they had won some big championship, and they came in their flip-flops. And all these articles about who comes to the White House in flip-flops.
Well, apparently today, Shayna, you can come in a sweatshirt. So I guess I think the categories have shifted. No, I think even, by the way, if I can just bring another pasuk from Megillat Esther, and I always teach this as well, of Vatilbash Esther Malchut, which is such an important, right, when she basically decides to be active in identity and to, plead the case for Am Yisrael. It's this very powerful moment where, of course, it means she actually puts on her finest clothing in order to appear before the king. But I think the pshat of that pasuk is very much the idea that she is assuming her identity as queen. The clothing is the reflection of that, but it's that moment where she's assuming that identity, and whether or not she fully inhabits it in her heart space. That's again that space between where we are in reality versus where we want to be, that she is reminding herself, this is my role. Even if I feel a little bit I'm fake it till you make it, but I am putting on Bigdei Malchut because this is how I will be able to have clout with the king. And I think that that's also that very powerful
You're touching
moment.
on one other element, which I think is, a final element, if we spoke about clothing as covering and as dignity, or as sending a message to other people, or identification in a group, or the way it influences the environment. One final element that you're touching on now, which is so crucial, maybe almost, of utmost significance, is the way that clothing influences the way we feel. So you said a minute ago when you said, I needed to feel good and I wanted to feel excited, so I changed into the bright pink outfit, or she has to psych herself up. I'm the queen. My gili, I could walk in here, I could ask for something, I'm the queen. I think that's avelut, whether or not people are feeling it when they are in mourning, but the ripping of the clothing is it's not just an expression to other people. It's a reminder of the state that I'm in, right now, or for sure tzitzit, it's supposed to be that's not about other people. Today it's is that person wearing tzitzit? It's not really about other people seeing tzitzit. Something that's supposed to be a reminder to a person that wears them. You look at them and it reminds you of how, who you are, what values are important to you. And I think so too, that, that idea of that clothing really impacts us. I know for myself, like when I would study for tests, like in high school or whatever, I needed to be like dressed. It didn't work well for me there's other people are like, what are you talking about? I need to be comfy and, all cozy or whatever, but you wouldn't think it matters. But it does. Like clothing influences the way we feel when we get dressed up. Sometimes we feel more self-confident. Even recently, you sent me a podcast so interesting about suits and
great
men.
Episode on trigonometry. An episode, I could say his first name. His first name is Dimitri. I'm having a hard time saying his last name. I looked it up. I couldn't say it, but look it up on trigonometry. Yeah, about suits.
About suits and like the way that after COVID, they thought no one's ever going to want to get dressed again, especially men in suits. And to the contrary, there's such a feeling of like, no, men looking for a little bit more of that masculinity. And it threw me back to the first debate that I ever did in high school. It was so scary because it was the big MTA debate, and I was a little 10th grade, sweet little girl.
You have the most vivid childhood memories that I know
I'll tell you, because this is the first time that I met my husband, thinking about like how you remember people. I walked in and I met up with the two captains of the MTA debate, and they were, only in 11th grade in high school, but they were wearing suits and ties, and they did this thing where every time they stood up to speak, they would button their suit, and it was like, it was intimidating. And just like, for them, it's like, look at me, I'm in the suit. And for the person watching, but I think the clothing.
And one of them was Judah? That was the point of, okay.
Yeah. When we met later, I'm like, I think I debated you in high school, and it wasn't the most pleasant experience. We then went and found the debate sheet, but I won't share publicly what they wrote there. Okay. Anyway, I do think that element of like realizing sometimes that clothing affects not just how other people look at us, not just the messages we give off, but maybe first and foremost, the way that we feel. And we could influence ourselves sometimes by the choices that we make.
Totally. I think something that I definitely want to make clear from all this conversation is that there is obviously a very, very fine line between the conversation we're trying to have, which is a little bit to look at clothing as a kli. It's a tool, and we want to utilize it, and we also want to transcend it, to sliding into a space where the clothing becomes the ultimate goal. Meaning we are looking at it as all the things all the ways that clothing function, right? Identifies as part of a community. They, impact our mood. They impact the way people, how they perceive us, and they impact the environment itself. Like, I, God forbid, don't want anyone to take this to think that. Meaning, I'll say like this, there's such a backlash in the world when it comes to clothing in the conversation of tzniut, which we've kind of purposefully left on the side. We're not having that conversation today in that same...
Not because we can't, but because it's been had so many times.
Exactly.
There's so much more to say.
There's such a backlash against that, that sometimes we, like all backlashes, it can go too far in one direction. And then we overlook I think, mahuti, the deeper, more essential roles that clothing does have. And whether or not we want to admit it, it impacts. Meaning, that's the thing about this whole topic. Whether you want to dial into the conversation or not, this is something that is having an impact on your life. It's impacting the way you get up in the morning. It's impacting how your kids are behaving, interactions between you and your children. It's impacting how it makes you feel. All of those things are happening, whether or not somebody is verbalizing or not. And so I think that it's such an important conversation because we're not saying this is the goal. No, meaning this is, one should realize how this can potentially, and hopefully in a positive way, impact themselves and their environment. And by raising awareness around it, we can wield this kli.
I love that word. I think that's what it is.
Like we can wield it.
It's a vessel. It's an instrument that has so much power. And if we could dafka empower people to lean into that and embrace it, I actually find that it's concepts that deeply resonate. And also, I always tell my students when I teach this topic and when we start with these ideas that are not about, the halakhot of tzniut, they're about dress, that they're relevant to everybody. They're relevant not just also to men, but that I would be willing, and
just also
I think,
to women.
But I would be willing also to talk about this to people that aren't Jewish, because you see, as the podcast that you mentioned, or all the time I'm on the lookout for articles, and if you keep your eyes open for this, there's so many articles in like the regular secular, let's say even American media, about dress and how should I come to work, or how should I dress for an interview, or what does this mean about me, or how long. A student once sent me an article about how every length of a skirt sends a different message, or like affects the woman wearing it in a different way. These aren't people who are, clued into what Tanakh has to say about this. It's just a part of our world. And I think empowering people to be honest about it, to recognize it, to own it, and then to think carefully about where they see themselves in all of that is something that moves people forward in a positive way.
Shayna, thank you for this conversation.
Always
a pleasure.
Always fun.
I'm sure that, I also want to say that I really encourage, and maybe I should say this in the beginning, this is a great episode to share with one's kids. I think that this is a conversation that can sometimes, these are very fraught conversations with our children. And I think that if one thinks that this could be resonant, I think it's a good one to share, because it can kind of, we always know that sometimes having an outsider say something is easier than when we say it to our children.
Just put this on in the car.
Yeah, just really very smoothly played in the car. And I think that it's one that could maybe open up some meaningful conversation. So thank you, Shayna, for always doing that.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.